Hi, I'm Kim O'Rourke, and in this video we're going to talk about how you cut your fabric for your binding, how to calculate how much you need, and yeah, how to cut it. So let's get started. I'm just going to flick back on my camera to show you the Celtic applique wall hanging. Now, if you saw my previous video when I explained the difference between bias binding and straighter grain binding, you will have seen why we need the differences. So I'd encourage you to go and watch that video first. But both of these bindings here are 1/2 inch width bindings, so 1/2 inch finished size of binding. And we need to start both of these bindings with strips. And I start them in very slightly different ways. Now, the standard calculation to get your width of the strip that you need is you decide what your width here needs to be on your binding width. Now, this is a 1/2 inch. This is a standard size that you would use to finish your quilts, your table runners, and so on. I tend to use this on most projects. So if I'm going to start with 1/2 inch, the general maths is that whatever you want to finish with, you multiply by 4 to start off with a strip of fabric. So that's not very good English, is it? So in order to get a 1/2 inch finished binding, I need a 2 inch strip. That's the general rule. You multiply that 1/2 inch by 4 and you would cut 2 inches of a strip of fabric. Now, if I'm making Celtic applique, or I need a strip like this for Celtic applique or stained glass window, and I need this finished size of 1/2 inch, I would cut that 2 inch strip of fabric. And don't worry, in a moment I'm going to show you how to cut a bias strip, so just bear with me for a couple of minutes. But what I have found with this straighter grain binding, particularly for finishing off a project, because we need to sew it on, and generally we've sewn it on with our machine one side and we hand stitch it the other side. It depends what we're doing. I'm going to talk to you about that in another video, but we tend to be machine stitching one side and then we'll have to hand finish it, or maybe machine finish it on the other side. But when we do that, we'll want to be covering our stitch line with the bit that we've pulled over. And I found that if I start with a 2 inch strip, there's not quite enough to pull it round and cover my stitch line. So I always start with a 2.5 inch strip of fabric in order to do that. And I still end up with a 1/2 inch, but it just gives me a little bit of wriggle room when I'm trying to cover those stitch lines, and all will become clear as we start to make it. So for my binding, to finish with a 1/2 inch binding piece here, I start with, me personally, I start with a 2.5 inch strip. If I were you, experiment, start with a 2 inch, start with a 2.5 inch as well. Just experiment and see which is easier for you. With anything, when you're trying new techniques, I would start on a test project. Don't go live onto your beautiful quilt or project that you've just made. Do a test run on a dummy piece first, and see how that goes and see how it works for you, and then decide which way forward you want to go. So this is a 2.5 inch strip. This has been just cut straighter grain as normal, like we would just normally cut a strip. That would make this binding here. If I'm going to cut all this thread appears. If I'm going to cut on the bias, then that's a whole different kettle of fish. So I'm still going to cut a 2.5 inch strip just to show you, but I'm going to cut a bias strip to demonstrate that. So let's get that out of the way and get a piece of fabric here. If any of you have watched me for a little while, you know I like to do my videos real time so that you can work along with me and you can pause it, get your stuff out and work along with me. I don't like to hide anything because I don't think that helps you very much. So what I've got here is a piece of fabric. If you're going to cut bias strips, I would start with a generally square piece of fabric. This is slightly rectangular, but it would do for demonstration purposes. So I've got my selvage up one end. As always with patchwork, I want to give myself a straight edge to start with. So I am going to, I think this is a straight edge because it's not long been used, but I am always going to start with cutting off a little bit at the end to make sure that I've got a nice straight edge to run with. So I'm going to get my fabric lined up. So I use my cutting mat not for measurements, but I use it to line up my fabric here to make sure it's straight. If I'm happy with that, let me just get that lined up. So I've got a ruler going along the bottom here to make sure it's straight. I know it looks a bit wobbly on the camera, but promise me, I promise it's straight. So if I'm happy with that, I'm going to get rid of that little bit on the edge there. So that gives me a nice straight edge to start with. So I'm actually going to move that up to the top to start with, because if you look on your ruler, you'll see that you've got 45-degree angles. If I bring that up to the camera, I think you can see there's a 45-degree angle. So get to know your ruler and look at where the lines are. And I'm going to start with cutting myself a 45-degree line, and that's to get me going on the bias to start with, because if you remember, our bias is this stretch in the middle here. We've got our warp and we've got our weft. They're not very stretchy at all, but our bias is very stretchy, so we want to be cutting on the bias for any bias strips to get our stretch. So we need to be cutting at 45-degree angles. And it is really easy when you know how, but this can be, it's going to do your head in just a little bit. So this is why I put this at the top, just to start with. So we get that 45-degree line there, and we're going to put that line along the top of that straight edge we've just cut. I'm going to put that 45-degree line on that straight edge. Okay. Don't worry about anything else, just get that 45-degree line on that straight edge. If I'm happy with that, then I'm going to cut this little bit off. Just be careful of your fingers. Okay, so there's a little triangle you can use. And as soon as I've got that, that is where I start cutting from. So if I want to start cutting 2.5-inch strips, so this is my diagonal, my 45-degree angle, I can then start cutting my strips. So if I want a 2.5-inch strip, I'm going to line my 2.5-inch up that edge there. If I turn this ruler around, it's Natalie this is Creative Grids ruler. I love Creative Grids rulers. They're so easy to see, and they're non-slippy as well. I'm not on commission from them at all, I just happen to love them. So on here you can see I've got 2.5-inch line here, because I want to cut a 2.5-inch strip in this particular example, and that 2.5-inch line runs all the way down that edge of that line I've just cut off. And if I'm happy with that, just as you would normally, I've cut up there. So that's my first strip, and let me cut another couple to show you how that all works. Of course, as you go along this fabric, you can move up your cutting mat, because it gets longer and longer as you go into the middle of your fabric. So I'm going to move that because I'm off the bottom of my cutting mat. So 2.5-inch strip again on that line. If I'm happy, cutting off. And I can keep doing that all the way along. And by the way, you can see I've got this gorgeous fabric here. This is a Moda fabric from a little while ago, it has to be said. Pattern fabrics, they make amazing binding, especially when they're cut on the bias. The pattern all gets just looped up. It makes amazing. Oh, here's one. And this is a digital print. This is from my Celtic applique. It's just a lovely, lovely binding. It makes it really interesting. So if you find fabrics that have swirls or any kind of big design on them, don't let it put you off, because if it won't fit into your quilt, and definitely look at using it for the binding, because they make really interesting finishes. So let's just cut one more strip so that you can see. Again, I'm going to have to move it up. Okay, so my 2.5 inch line, my measurement goes along that cut edge, and I'm happy with that. And it's coming off the edge of the camera because my camera's not big enough. I need an overhead gantry really, but I've got one. So there we go, we've got 3 strips here. They are all cut on the bias. So if I pull that, you'll see it's got a nice lot of stretch. So by the time it's made, when I want to go around curves and corners, this will go round beautifully for me. So that's how to cut your bias binding strips. Your straight grain strips are just as you would normally cut your strips of fabric out. So nothing really to show there, but in the next video I'll show you how to join your strips, because that's the next stage that you would want to do. So I'll see you in the next video. Hope that's been helpful, and bye for now.